year was 2147, the time when humanity had finally conquered its greatest adversaries: disease, imperfection, and even death. At least, that's what the propaganda posters plastered across the gleaming skyscrapers of Neo-London proclaimed. "The future is flawless," they read, showcasing images of impossibly beautiful genetically designed humans. These perfects, as they were called, represented the pinnacle of human achievement. They were engineered in high-tech biolabs, their genes meticulously edited to eliminate any flaws. Perfects were faster, smarter, and more resilient than their natural-born predecessors. They were in every way superior. But for every utopia, there was a shadow, a price paid in silence. Beneath the city's polished facade, deep within its industrial underbelly, lurked the rejects. These were the unintended consequences of humanity's hubris, the living embodiment of its mistakes. The rise of genetic engineering. It all began decades ago, when CRISPR technology became accessible to the masses. At first, it was a miracle, a cure for hereditary diseases, the end of genetic disorders. But as the technology advanced, so did its uses. Parents, driven by the desire to give their children the best start in life, began editing their offspring for enhanced intelligence, athletic prowess, and beauty. The government, seeing the economic potential, funded research to accelerate the process. The perfects were born. For a while, it seemed like the dawn of a golden age. Perfects filled the highest echelons of society, excelling in every field imaginable. But nature, it turned out, wasn't so easily tamed. The human genome was complex, its interactions delicate and nuanced. While most engineered humans thrived, some developed anomalies, mutations that no algorithm could predict. These anomalies gave rise to the rejects, born with physical deformities, neurological disorders, or bizarre, controllable traits. They were abandoned by their creators and ostracized by society. Officially, they didn't exist. Unofficially, they were Neo-London's dirty secret. Dr. Elara Vega's fall from grace? Dr. Elara Vega stood at the forefront of this genetic revolution. Once hailed as a visionary, she had been instrumental in developing the techniques that made perfects possible. But her career had ended in scandal after a high-profile project went catastrophically wrong. The child she had helped design had been born with severe mutations. Its body twisted, its mind fragmented. The media dubbed the case Project Chimera, and Elara became a pariah overnight. I am more racked with guilt. Elara retreated from public life. She lived in a small, cluttered apartment in the outskirts of the city, surrounded by outdated lab equipment and books on bioethics. She spent her days researching genetic anomalies, hoping to understand what had gone wrong. Despite her self-imposed exile, she couldn't escape the consequences of her work. Every day, she saw perfects walking the streets, their flawless faces the haunting reminder of the legacy she had helped create. And every night, she dreamed of the rejects, their hollow eyes, their misshapen forms. They were her failures, and she couldn't forget them, the rejects' underground world. While the perfects lived in luxury, the rejects had carved out an existence in the city's forgotten places. The underworld of Neo-London was a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels, crumbling factories, and makeshift shelters. Here the rejects survived on scraps, scavenging what they could from the surface. Despite their dire circumstances, the rejects were resourceful. They had formed a loose community, bound together by necessity. Leaders emerged, individuals who used their unique traits to protect and guide others. One such leader was Kale, a young man with luminescent skin that glowed faintly in the dark. Kale had been abandoned as a child, but he had grown into a fierce protector of his people. He dreamed of a day when the rejects could walk the surface without fear. The rejects had their own rudimentary form of science, repurposing discarded technology to study their conditions. They knew that their mutations weren't random. They were the result of the same genetic engineering that created the perfects, and they resented the society that had cast them aside. The perfect's fragile utopia. Meanwhile, the perfect's world was not as flawless as it seemed. Despite their enhancements, they faced mounting pressure to maintain their superiority. The competition was relentless, and any sign of weakness was a potential death sentence in the corporate and political arenas. Moreover, cracks were beginning to show in their genetic design. Minor health issues, once unheard of among perfects, were becoming more common. Some whispered of a new illness, a mysterious condition that seemed to target only the genetically engineered. The government dismissed these rumors as fear-mongering, but the whispers grew louder. A chance encounter. Elara's life changed one rainy evening when she ventured into the industrial district in search of genetic samples rumored to be discarded by a biotech firm. She had heard whispers of rejects scavenging in the area. She wasn't prepared for what she found. As she navigated the maze of rusted pipes and broken machinery, she stumbled upon a group of rejects huddled around a makeshift fire. At first, they were hostile, their mistrust evident in their wary eyes. But when Kale recognized her, and his luminescent face lighting up with a mixture of anger and curiosity, they decided to hear her out. Elara explained her purpose. She was searching for answers, trying to understand the anomalies that plagued them. Kale, skeptical but desperate, agreed to help her. In exchange, he demanded that she use her knowledge to improve their lives. A growing understanding? Over the following weeks, Elara spent more time with the rejects, collecting samples and learning about their lives. She discovered that many of their mutations were not entirely detrimental. Kale's glowing skin, for instance, was bioluminescent, a trait that could have applications in medical imaging or sustainable lighting. Another reject, a girl named Mira, had heightened senses that allowed her to navigate the underworld with ease. Alana began to see the rejects not as mistakes, but as a testament to humanity's resilience and adaptability. She realized that the real horror wasn't their existence, it was the society that had discarded them. The seeds of change. As Elara delved deeper into her research, she uncovered a shocking truth. The anomalies in the rejects' genes were the result of deliberate tampering. Some of the mutations were engineered, not accidental. It seemed that someone in power had been using the rejects as a testing ground for experimental modifications. This revelation shook her to her core. The same society that celebrated perfection had been secretly exploiting those it deemed unworthy. Elara knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. But the path ahead was fraught with danger. If she exposed the truth, she would make powerful enemies. And if she aligned herself with the rejects, she would become a target for both the government and the biotech corporations. Dr. Hayes and Opry wanted the battle to start by making something truly worse, but then they were just going to name it something different. As the tension between the perfects and the rejects grew, Elara found herself at a crossroads. The world she had helped create was crumbling, and only she had the knowledge to reshape it. But doing so would require her to confront the true horrors of humanity. The greed, the arrogance, and the fear that had driven them to this point. For the first time in years, Elara felt a spark of hope. The rejects weren't the problem, they were the solution. Together, they could challenge the narrative of perfection and build a world that embraced all of humanity's complexities. And so, with Keld and his community by her side, Elara began her journey, not just to atone for her past, but to forge a future where no one would be discarded as a mistake. Dr. Elara Vega sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life she no longer recognized. The once brilliant geneticist, celebrated for her groundbreaking work, now lived in obscurity. The accolades, the interviews, the fame, all had disappeared after the disaster of Project Chimera. The quiet hum of her old repurposed hollow computer was the only sound in the room, a constant reminder of her obsession. Elara's fingers hovered over the keys as she reviewed the genetic sequencing files that had haunted her dreams for years. The data was burned into her mind, the irregular splicing, the chaotic overlap of incompatible genes. She had memorized every flaw, every anomaly, but she still couldn't understand why it had gone so catastrophically wrong. Her mind wandered to the child she had created. No, the child she had failed. Born with a body that defied anatomy, the boy had lived for only a few weeks. His brief existence was marked by agony, his cries echoing in the sterile laboratory. She could still hear them piercing through the silence of her nights. You killed him, the whispers in her mind accused. You played God and you failed. Or she slammed her fist onto the desk, scattering a pile of printed genetic charts. Her guilt was a living thing, gnawing at her insides. She had tried to run from it, burying herself in isolation, but it always found her. "It's gonna be fine," I told her, my voice hoarse. The call to action. Her self-imposed exile was interrupted one rainy evening when her holocom buzzed with an incoming message. She stared at the blinking light, her heartbeat quickening. She hadn't received a call in months. Hesitant, she pressed the accept button. A man's face appeared, his features sharp and urgent. It was Dr. Marcus Hale, a former colleague and one of the few people who had stood by her after the Chimera scandal. "Elara," he began, his voice tense. "I need your help." "Marcus?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "What's going on?" "It's happening again," he said, leaning closer to the camera. "There's a new case. Another child. Same anomalies." Her blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Project Chimera was shut down. The protocols were destroyed." "Not all of them," Marcus admitted, guilt flickering across his face. "The company continued the research in secret. They thought they could fix the errors." Fine." Elara's hands clenched into fists. "And now another child is suffering because of their arrogance?" Marcus nodded. "I've seen the reports. The anomalies are worse this time. The child won't survive much longer." "Send me the data," she said finally. "I'll see what I can do." The investigation. The files arrived within the hour, encrypted and heavily redacted. Elara's eyes scanned the data, her stomach twisting, as she recognized the same patterns of genetic instability that had plagued Project Chimera. But there was something new, something more sinister. The anomalies weren't just errors. They seemed deliberate, as if someone had intentionally introduced instability into the genome. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she cross-referenced the data with her own records. She stayed up all night, driven by a mix of anger and determination. By morning, she had uncovered a trail leading back to Genses, the biotech corporation that had funded her original research. Gensis had always been ambitious, pushing the boundaries of ethical science. But this was monstrous. They hadn't just continued the experiments, they had escalated them, using techniques that were dangerously experimental. Elara knew she couldn't confront Gensis alone. She needed allies, people who had a stake in exposing the truth. Her mind turned to the rejects, the underground community of genetically engineered outcasts she had encountered weeks earlier. They had a vested interest in bringing down the systems that had created them. Perhaps they would help her, if she could gain their trust. Into the underworld. Elara returned to the industrial district, where the rejects had carved out their hidden enclave. The labyrinth of abandoned tunnels and crumbling factories was as unwelcoming as she remembered. Her presence was met with suspicion, the shadowed figures of rejects watching her from the darkness. "Canceled it, okay?" Kale, the de facto leader, emerged to greet her. His bioluminescent skin cast an eerie glow, illuminating the scars that crisscrossed his face. "You're back," he said, his tone unreadable. Lara took a deep breath. "I need your help. Jensen's is continuing their experiments. They've created another child with severe anomalies. If we don't act, that child will die. Kale's expression hardened. And you think we care? The perfects abandon us. Why should we save one of their own? This isn't about the perfects, Elara argued. It's about exposing the truth. Genesis isn't just harming children, they're endangering everyone. The same techniques that created you were used to create the perfects. If their methods are flawed, it affects all of us. Kale considered her words, his glowing eyes narrowing. Oh, what do you need from us? Access, she said. Genesis keeps their most sensitive data on a secure server. I need someone who can get me inside. Kale nodded slowly. We have someone who can help, but if we do this, you owe us. We're not just pawns in your game. Agreed, and Lara said, whatever you need, I'll do it. The infiltration. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. Under the cover of darkness, Elara and a small group of rejects made their way to the Genesis facility. Their infiltrator, a wiry teenager named Lynn with enhanced reflexes, hacked into the building's security system, creating a brief window for them to slip inside. The sterile, gleaming corridors of the facility were a stark contrast to the grimy underworld they had come from. Elara felt a pang of familiarity as they passed rows of cryogenic storage units containing genetic samples. This was her world, her creation. And a shame. They reached the server room without incident, but the data was heavily encrypted. As Elara worked to decrypt the files, an alarm blared, shattering the silence. Security forces swarmed the facility, their footsteps echoing in the halls. Sorry, we've been compromised, Kale shouted, drawing a makeshift weapon. Elara's heart raced as she hurried to extract the data. The rejects fought valiantly, using their unique traits to hold off the guards. Kale's glowing skin disoriented their attackers, while Lynn's speed allowed her to outmaneuver them. Despite their efforts, it was clear they were outmatched. We've got what we need, Elara said, pulling the data drive from the terminal. Let's go. They fled through a maintenance tunnel, narrowly escaping capture. By the time they emerged into the night, they were battered and exhausted, but alive. The revelation? Back in the safety of the Rejects Enclave, Elara analyzed the stolen data. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Genesis had been using the Rejects as test subjects, introducing experimental modifications into their genomes to refine the techniques used on the perfects. The anomalies weren't accidents. They were deliberate byproducts of a system that valued profit over ethics. Worse, the data revealed that the mysterious illness affecting the perfects was linked to these experiments. The genetic modifications were destabilizing over time, creating a ticking time bomb within the perfect's DNA. Without intervention, their society would collapse. Elara shared her findings with Kale and the other rejects. The room fell silent as they absorbed the truth. For years, they had believed they were the mistakes, the unwanted byproducts of a flawed system. Now they knew there was something else entirely, the victims of a calculated experiment. What do we do now? Kale asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Elara's resolve hardened. We expose them. We show the world what Genesis has done, and we make sure no one else suffers like this again. Kale nodded. Then let's finish what you started. Together, they began planning their next move, knowing that the fight ahead would be their most dangerous yet. But for the first time in years, Elara felt a sense of purpose. She couldn't undo the horrors of her past, but she could fight to make things right. Neo-London awoke to chaos. Across the city, screens lit up with leaked footage and documents exposing Jensen's atrocities. The rejects, suffering, the genetic manipulations, and the growing instability within the perfects were now public knowledge. The revelation was a seismic shock to a society built on the illusion of perfection. Perfects who had once walked the streets with unshakable confidence now glanced nervously at their own reflections, wondering how long their supposed invincibility would last. For Dr. Elara Vega, the weeks following the leak were a whirlwind of emotion. She had hoped the truth would spark change, but instead it ignited fear. Jen says executives condemn the leaks as fabrications, using their vast resources to suppress dissent and spin the narrative. Protesters clashed with corporate security forces, and the city teetered on the brink of collapse. But the worst was yet to come. Hidden in the stolen data was a discovery Elara had kept secret from everyone, even Kale. The genetic destabilization in the perfects wasn't isolated. It was spreading, mutating, a silent epidemic with the potential to wipe out the entire population of Neo-London. The rejects unite. In the depths of the underground enclave, Kale addressed a gathering of rejects. His bioluminescent skin cast an eerie glow over the crowd, illuminating faces marked by pain, resilience, and hope. "We've spent our lives in the shadows," he began, his voice steady but filled with passion. "They called us mistakes, abandoned us, and used us, but now the world knows the truth. They're afraid of us, not because of what we are, but because of what we represent." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Resistance is still out there," Kale continued, "and they'll do everything they can to silence us. But we have something they don't: the will to fight and the knowledge to win. We're not just rejects. We're survivors, and now we're a force." Elara watched from the edge of the gathering, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and trepidation. She had seen Kale grow into a leader, but she also knew the stakes were higher than he realized. The fight wasn't just about justice. It was about survival. He looked towards the Phoenix, little bit drained from her, and tried to move on. After the meeting, Kale approached her. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked, his glowing eyes narrowing. Elara hesitated, then sighed. "The genetic instability in the perfects isn't just a flaw. It's contagious. If it spreads, it could trigger a pandemic unlike anything we've ever seen." Kale's expression darkened. "And you're just now telling me this?" "I needed to be sure," she said. "But now that I am, we need to act fast. Genesis has the resources to contain this, or at least mitigate it. But they won't do it unless they're forced to." Kale nodded grimly. "Then we'll force them." The perfect's dilemma. In the upper echelons of Neo-London, the perfects faced a crisis of identity. For decades, they had been the apex of humanity, the living embodiment of progress. Now their superiority was crumbling. Families whispered of sudden illnesses, cognitive lapses, and physical anomalies that defied explanation. One of these perfects was Astra Lyell, a celebrated athlete and public figure. She had been a symbol of perfection, her genetically enhanced abilities making her a star. But in recent weeks, she had experienced fainting spells and unexplained tremors. When she saw the leaked footage of the rejects and the truth about Genesis, something inside her shifted. Astra sought out Elara, tracking her to the underground enclave. The sight of the rejects shocked her, their deformities, their resilience, their humanity. But it was Elara who struck her most. The scientist's wary eyes held a depth of knowledge and regret that Astra couldn't ignore. You created us," Astra said, her voice trembling. "You made us perfect, and now you're saying we're dying?" Elara nodded. "I'm trying to fix it, but I can't do it alone. If the perfects and the rejects unite, we might stand a chance." Astra hesitated, then extended her hand. "Tell me what to do." The alliance. Bringing the perfects and rejects together was no small feat. Decades of prejudice and mistrust stood between them, but KO and Astro became the bridge. Together, they organized clandestine meetings where perfects who had begun to question their world met rejects who had been discarded by it. The first meeting was tense. Perfects and rejects eyed each other warily, their differences stark. But as the night wore on, stories were shared. Perfects spoke of the pressure to maintain their flawless images, the fear of failure. Rejects spoke of abandonment, survival, and resilience. By the end of the night, a fragile understanding had formed. "We're not so different," Astra said, addressing the group. "We're all victims of the same system. If we stand together, we can change it." The battle for Gensense. The Alliance's first major action was an assault on Gensen's primary research facility. It was a risky operation, but they had no choice. The facility housed the equipment and data needed to develop a cure for the genetic instability. Elara led the mission, accompanied by Kale, Astra, and a team of rejects and perfects. They infiltrated the facility under the cover of darkness, using their combined abilities to outmaneuver the security forces. Inside, they found horrors beyond their imagination. Rows of cryogenic chambers contained test subjects, perfects and rejects alike, suspended in a state of half-life. Their bodies twisted by experimental modifications. The sight steeled their resolve. "This ends now," Kale said, smashing a control panel. While Kale and Astra led the others in securing the facility, Elara worked frantically to download the data. As she navigated the labyrinth of files, she found something unexpected: a prototype serum that could stabilize the genetic anomalies. It was untested, but it was their only hope. Redemption? As they prepared to leave, the group was ambushed by Gensense's private security forces. A fierce battle ensued, with casualties on both sides. Kale was injured, his glowing skin dimming as he fought to protect the others. Astra used her enhanced agility to disarm attackers, her determination unyielding. Elara, clutching the serum, faced a moment of reckoning. She could escape and leave the fight behind, or she could stay